Bonjour, Gemak, Mino Gigro Nenok, Ni Anishinaabe, Nin Saojik, Wedem Chiking Donjaba, Chinen Damdash Mino, Ibajayam Ampi, Baugting, Mage Bauting, Nish Nikea Kidum, Bauting. Mino Dash Nias Miguachuin, week Jivan go on. We bid the Bajamagwa Gundak. Gadogema Benanik, Ga Kidwat, Ga Jichigeat, Ga Shkitoat. So myself, I was asked by Angus to come up here and talk. So what we say, Nui the Bajamak Gundak, Gadogema Benanik, we want to talk about our former chiefs. And I said what they had, I want to focus on what they've said and also what they've done. And also what they were able to do, and I guess their aspirations. So when we look at the record, of course, we look at history books, we don't see this. None of this, what I'm going to show you, is actually written and published in curricular books that children are in schools in. Things are starting to change, of course, with the internet, that people see a lot more stuff written down. But when I went to school, kai wika angi gindazin gajwa bakmampi baugting mage odem nido minising mino dash Anishinaabe odakimwan. Anywhere around Anishinaabe king, none of this was really written down in any of the textbooks that I've seen. But if any of you are really interested and eager, where I got the inspiration for this, I read a thesis by Manda thesis, and her name is Catherine Sims, and she did her thesis and it was called Gathering to Give and Gathering to Receive, and she talked about the presents, what they would call the Indian presence. So these Indian presence are actually part of that Treaty of Niagara. And the Treaty of Niagara, what we say is, we call it a treaty, but of course, as some of you know now, Canada and Ontario did not call that a treaty. They didn't want to call that a treaty. Anyway, it's the Anishinaabe understanding is that that's a treaty. And they promised us that they would deliver us what the chiefs called warmth. They would give us warmth every year as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the waters run. So they promised us that, and as long as the British were red. So these promises should still be in effect, basically. But of course, we had to fight to keep that going as long as it did. So from 1764 up to 1852 or 1854 is when these presents were actually given. And I'll touch upon where these were given. Of course, it was at Niagara. There were different stations. One was at Niagara, another at Detroit and Amherstburg, and then Michilimackinac. But we'll talk a bit about that. But the main thing of that I want to share here is that what I'm going to talk about here are the speeches that the chiefs gave at that council fire. And when they gave those speeches, somebody had to write those down. So I want to just stay right off the top that it wasn't us that wrote this down, on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's all that we got. And myself as a historian, I don't dismiss what was written, because you'll see actually that there's a continuity of what they've said through the years. So if they keep saying it, then there is a grain of truth in it. So one of the things that we're going to see here is they're going to ask for education, but they're also going to ask for Christianity. And they tie the two together. And of course, back then, the two were tied together. So what I want you to really think about is when we look at these words and hear these words, to try and understand what the chiefs were getting at there. Of course, the other thing that they're going to talk about are land and incursions on their territory. So you'll see through these different speeches around the council fire that they actually expressed a lot of their desire and their need, and what they also thought was going to help their what they would say their grandchildren. So in these documents, once in a while they'll say generations to come, but I've never actually seen them say 7 generations. They just say Wabiyajik or Wabimadzajik, the ones that are to come, the ones that will, the future generations, that's what they would say. So we got to look at this in a sense that there's an inherent bias. That's what we got to recognize right off the bat, that there's an inherent bias because they're using English. And then the other thing, the other inherent bias is the Jaganash gi Jibiyan Mandaga Kedwat Gondak Anishinaabe. That it was the Jaganash who wrote down what the Anishinaabe was saying at that council fire. So we got to look at it as a 2-step removal. So this chief would stand up at the fire and then he would speak. And then Bejik Aptonzi Mage Mekdekonye Gi Ankanotage. Then this priest or Métis would then translate what was said. And then the scribe of the government would write down what was said by the translator or interpreter. So that's why I say there's two steps removed from what the actual chief had said, his actual words. Because they didn't write down in Anishinaabe what the chief had said. Because at that time, Gimak, Kina Gimak, Gi Anishinaabe Mok. All the chiefs then there just spoke Anishinaabe Win. Mage Wem Tgojimo Win Anin Wem Tgojimok. But some of them spoke French as well. So, and if they spoke a bit of English, it wasn't enough to express their aspirations. So that's what I want to just preface these remarks with. First off is by saying that to make you aware of that this is a written English record by basically Indian Affairs. So we have to start with these. I didn't bother to come and talk about the actual belts to do a recital or anything, because I feel like I've done that, and some of you have heard me do that. So I just thought it would be a bit redundant, although actually the one thing that should be pointed out is that from 1764 to 1798, the Odawa of La Arbor Cross, which is now called Harbor Springs, were the keepers of these belts. And then whenever they had the delivery of the presents at Michilimackinac, usually, but not all the time, they'd bring these belts out. And when these belts were brought out, then they would recite what they mean. To the point that all of our chiefs understood that and that some of them could recite it. Of course, there's 2 chiefs. The Odawa were the caretakers of it, but there are 2 Ojibwe chiefs that I know for sure that actually could recite it. And one was, of course, Jigwa Kons from Ktagan Zibing. Chief Shingwak, he numerous times in the historic record, he actually got up and spoke about the promises that were made at Niagara. Another chief is named Chief Bem Goneshkang, and he wrote this down in Chiging in 1862, but he Anishinaabe on Manda Gigadowin. But he wrote this down in Ojibwe in June of 1862 in Chiging. So that to me is the main document that I use when I recite this belt, and at one point I had that whole speech memorized in Ojibwe, but I'm getting older and things are starting to fall. But to me, that's our main document that we would use when we refer to our speeches and our understanding of our treaty relationship. So the chiefs would gather around the council fire at Michilimackinac, and then after the American Revolution, Michilimackinac became territory of the Chimokmanak, the Americans. And so they were told then, actually this was earlier, but the British stayed on until 1796 and 1798, Jay's Treaty. And then they were told, you have to vacate Michilimackinac, take the garrison, and the British have to remove themselves from Michilimackinac. So they set up at St. Joseph's Island. And I know Dean's been out there, but that's where the chiefs used to gather from 1796 up to 1812. And that's where all the presents used to be delivered to the Anishinaabeg. And the other thing that I want you to impress upon you is that all these different nations came there. The Sauk, the Fox, the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk, the Ojibwe, Udawak, Bode-Adamik. All these different nations from all around the Great Lakes came to Michilimackinac and to St. Joseph's Island. And when they came there, they would bring pipes, and they would bring strings of wampum, and sometimes they'd even bring, even the Sioux came there from west of the Mississippi. And when the Sioux came there one time, they brought it says they brought 6 otter skin bags, and they laid them down in front of the commanding officer. And then all these pipes and these wampum strings were kept in the commanding officer's storehouse there. And every year that they came, they were then to smoke those pipes again. And then like these belts were then to remember, use those wampum strings and those pipes to remember the relationship. So if that pipe weren't there anymore, they took it away, they're basically saying they don't agree with this anymore, that they removed that pipe from the commanding officer's house. And that means they're no longer part of this council fire. But as long as that pipe was there and that they came and they smoked it, then they were saying they still agreed with the overall principle of the alliance. So what we now know is that at Niagara especially, all these different pipes, they used to call, now we have these pipes that go from our elbow to our fingertip, the stem. But back then, those calumet stems were from our heart to the end of our fingertip. And that's how long the pipe stem was. And then they would sometimes they'd tie a string of wampum, but also on that string of wampum, they'd have the tail feathers of an eagle. Ginu malge megaze, gishpin megaze, wan kiwin, gishpin ginu, nashkat, migadwin. So if it were golden eagle feathers, then that's a war pipe. And if it were bald eagle feathers, then that's a pipe of peace. And then sometimes they would paint those feathers with that onaman, that red ochre, and then that meant war, of course. So anyway, when I talk about these belts here, that actually, to me, these belts represent our Aboriginal title, our sovereignty, as well as their acknowledgement that they're going to pay us what some would say is rent, or some say tribute, to be on our land, and that's those presents. And then also that there's an equality there. Anishinaabe and Jaganash standing together as in an alliance, military and trade alliance. So that's what these belts mean. They're more than, people call them friendship belt, but actually this is actually part of, if you look at the continuing relationship after the Royal Proclamation, when they said that you have to come and in an open conference to get into a treaty to cede land, you have to do that publicly. That's part of this wampum belt, that we accepted that. So there's more to that, but I wanted to just set the stage that this is what the chiefs knew. And when they came to Michilimackinac, and they came to St. Joseph's Island, and then during the War of 1812, the Americans came and burnt St. Joseph's Island. So then, and the Anishinaabeg actually took over Michilimackinac. So from 1812 to 1815, the presents were delivered at Michilimackinac because that was the headquarters. Then 1815 to 1828, they actually delivered the presents at Drummond Island. But in Anishinaabe Mwin, Bo Tagan Singh. Botaganising Jinkadewe Minis. That island is called Botaganising. And a botagan is a mortar where you pound corn. So I've never been there. I've never been to that island yet. But I want to go around. I don't know if they're referring to a bay that looks like a mortar, or if you know how, like at Dokis, they call that kikendat, where there's actually those kettles. I don't know if that's what they're calling the botagan there or what. Anyway, that place is called Botaganising, Drummond Island. That's where the presents were delivered from 1815 to 1828. Then 1829, it went back to St. Joseph's Island. And in 1830 to 35 to Penetanguishene. And then after that, they came to Manitoulin at Manitowoning, 1836 up to 1854. And so each time I'm telling you this, they're actually moving the council fire, what they call the council fire of the British. So that'll be an important part to remember later, is this whole idea of fire. So this is just before the War of 1812, and this is Lieutenant Governor Gore. And my buddy, Mabadash Nichke, Brian Charles Jinkaza, Gijiton Migis Pekkan. I found in the archives this document, and it was a design of the wampum belt that Francis Gore wanted to give to the Western Confederacy at Amherstburg. And when they sketched this out, and you see the sketch at the bottom, then we actually made it. But when in the speech he gave, he actually said that there are 11,550 grains of wampum. So we know we've used the exact number of beads in the belt, and we tried to replicate how it would have looked. So he reconstructed it. So the symbolism, of course, is Bejig Anishinaabe, Mino Bejig Jaganash, Nani Book, Eidwaying. On either side, the Anishinaabeg and the British stand, but they're connected by the heart in the middle. And that's to mean, again, when you hear people talk about that we are of one heart and one mind, and that's what this belt is supposed to represent. But in 1806, a deputation of Sauk, Fox, and Odawa people came to Amherstburg, which is just south of Detroit, and that was where the fort was for the British. And they brought war pipe. They wanted to go to war against the Americans in 1806. So they brought this pipe there, and they wanted to go to war, but the British weren't ready yet. They didn't want to go to war yet. So that's why Gore brought this belt, and he asked them to not go to war. And he says, this is to get your young men to sit quiet. So this was in July 1808, and this is Governor Gore's speech to the Western Confederacy. And the Western Confederacy, of course, is, we always say, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, but it actually included a lot more nations, including the Sioux, Sauk, Fox, Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and Illinois, and Wees, and Kickapoos, and Miamis. Children, it has been my wish and desire for a considerable time past to meet you in general council of all nations, that I might personally assure you of the King, your father's constant regard for his Indian children. Also to renew at this fireplace the ancient friendship which has subsisted for so long a span of time between your great father, your ancestors, and yourselves, and naturally and freely to communicate to each other in conformity to the engagements entered into by your forefathers and the English nation. Every incident or circumstance which might threaten to disturb the peace of the country or friendship and harmony, which has so happily subsisted for time out of mind between the King and all Indian nations. With this belt I therefore renew all our ancient friendships and those ancient customs with all the nations of this country. So again, each of these belts, when he puts a new one on, it's supposed to strengthen the original 1764 belt. It doesn't replace that. Children, I come not to invite you to take up the hatchet, but I wish to put you on your guard against any attempt that may be made by any enemy, whatever, to disturb the peace of your country. And I implore the Great Spirit now looking down upon us, and who directs and governs all the affairs of this world, to preserve this land from the misfortunes of war. Children, make my words known and send this belt of amity and friendship to all the Western Indians and others who are confederated with you. So the other thing, I used to work at the Chiefs of Ontario from 1996 to 2000. And back then, I never used to hear our Robinson Huron Treaty Chiefs talk about our treaty relationship as sacred. But whenever I listened to Treaty 3 Chiefs, they would always start off saying that our treaty is sacred. Treaty 3 Chiefs used to say that. And then I wondered afterward, how come we never say our treaty is sacred? And hear what this Governor Gore said, under the eye of the Great Spirit. And when I talk about that other wampum belt, 1764, that's what the chiefs say. They said that Sir William Johnson said, "Nishke ni Johnsiduk, kajem no non dak no ninagok." The Great Spirit hears me how I am talking to you today. So to me, whenever they invoke the Great Spirit, we should treat these then as sacred documents, that these are how our relationship was defined and envisioned under the Great Spirit, as well as the watchful eye of the Sun. So the other thing is that sometimes all the chiefs didn't have to be present, but they had to buy in after. So he said that, make sure my words reach all the other confederated tribes. So that was in July 1808. This one is 1813. And there was another belt, but I don't know what this belt looks like. And this fella, his name was Robert Dixon, and he was a fur trader. He actually lived with the Sioux out west. And he brought a bunch of the Sioux and Ojibwe from out west to come and fight at Michilimackinac. And when he distinguished himself so much that the governor ended up giving him a wampum belt to take out and get everyone else, all the different Anishinaabeg involved. So this is how our treaty relationship was strengthened again. And again, they actually said here, they always make reference to Sir William Johnson. So he says, "Remember Sir William Johnson, he told you, I would never forsake or abandon you. I have not, nor will I lose hold of the belt which has been so long among you. On the contrary, I will now make it stronger by the belt which I now present to you. And will never will I leave you, but as your father, see that justice is done to you by the big knives, and that your hunting grounds shall be preserved for your use." So he had a specific wampum belt that he went around and he went and talked to different nations in their communities and asked them to come on board. Then just prior to the War of 1812, as some of you may know, that Tecumseh actually wanted to fight for his own land. And same with us, the Odawak and the Ojibwe wanted to fight for our own land. And at one point, what the British had told us is they wanted to make what they called a buffer zone. And then also they called it a separate Indian country. So this gray area here is actually what they had proposed to the Anishinaabeg, that if the Anishinaabe and the British had won the War of 1812, this would have been a whole Indian country. That was what they were believing, and that's what they were going to fight for. So it's he again. Of course, they're really trying to get vilify the Americans, and then the Americans, of course, trying to vilify the British at that time as well. It says. But he's saying, "They must be told in a voice of thunder that the object of the war is to secure to the Indian nations the boundaries of their territories, and that all those who may be found within their boundaries shall perish if they do not immediately remove themselves." That's, he's telling them, you remove the Americans that are in your territory and we'll help you so that we can then establish this homeland for you. And all the people that are the Tecumseh and the Shawnee and all the Western Confederacy actually were on board with this. "And now, my children, I invite you to the war feast of your father. Be then courageous and stout-hearted, and depend upon it, and I shall hold firmly one end of the belt, whilst you hold the other, which shall bind us to assist one another against our common enemy." So, as some of you know, we had people from up this area that went and took over Fort Michilimackinac on July 17, 1812. They captured it. They, with 30 soldiers, 200 Canadian voyageurs, 113 Sioux, Menominee, Winnebago, and 280 Odawa and Ojibwe. That's who took over Fort Michilimackinac in 1812. And that was a pivotal point, because then that brought a bunch of Anishinaabeg on board. And then August 16, 1812, a bunch went down also to take Fort Detroit. And then that was also another pivotal moment in the War of 1812, because the Anishinaabeg went there and fought. But actually, just the mere threat of Anishinaabeg showing up, the Governor Hull ended up capitulating. So there was plus 600 warriors. So we don't know exactly how many. They didn't keep a record of how many came from where at Detroit. So these two gentlemen here, they believe one is Medas and the other is Ozit. Just kidding. I thought Nelson might have got that, but the one they say the one is Neosh, an Odawa chief named Neosh, and then the other is a Medas. So Medas, of course, back then Medas meant a legging, but now it means a sock, and so I said his name is Zit, the other is a foot. Neosh and Medas, these two chiefs, and they went down to Montreal, and when they went to Quebec, and they got they were painted there. This canoe was made later on in 1828 by Chief Jean-Baptiste Signac, and each of the men that are carved in there, he actually named them. And one is his brother Makadebenese, Odawa chief, and then his fellow chief Mukmanish, and then Makons, Gijago Benes, Eshkweganebe, an Ojibwe chief from Michigan, Shkweganebe, then Niwakum, an Ojibwe chief who is a Debosque ancestor, and then his co-chief Ashaugenshi. Ashaugenshi means the crayfish, and Niwakum means the night thunder, and Makadebenese, black hawk or black thunderbird. Of course, Mukmanish means a damn knife. And a Shkweganebe, Shkweying, something is at the end or at the back, and a Shkweganebe, the feather sits with the feather at the end. That's what that name means. And Makons, of course, is little bear. Also, Chibosh Kizagun was one of the chiefs that left Michilimackinac actually on August 12th to go down to Detroit. So he missed the Battle of Detroit, but he actually went down and he took, I forget how many canoes now, that followed him down there. And of course, either one of his descendants are part of this Robinson Huron Treaty later. So here's a breakdown. At the time of, just before the War of 1812, they listed all these different nations and where they were located and how many different fighting men the British were hoping that would side with them for the ensuing war. So here, this is an accounting of, at the U.S., the nations, the chiefs and people coming to Drummond Island in 1824 for presents. So anybody who fought during the War of 1812 could still come to Drummond Island, to what is now called Canada, to receive the bounty of their great father, the king. So you see, again, like I mentioned, Winnebagos, the Menominee, the Odawa, and the Chippewa were the primary ones that came in 1824, and their numbers are all long listed there. Why there are two sets of chiefs listed, you see here the first row of chiefs. Those are what they call deserving. So a deserving chief is one that they actually knew that fought during the War of 1812 or was wounded. And then these ones were chiefs that didn't necessarily participate during the War of 1812. So these ones got a thicker, bigger blanket, and they got a rifle instead of a gun. or a musket, and they would get more silver in the way of armbands or brooches or gorgets. So the same thing here. In 1826, these are the U.S. ones, Iodawa, Chippewa, Menominee. So you see that I just really can't stress enough that it was a bigger confederacy, because now we talk about three fires, but back then it also included the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk. Ho-Chunk are called Winnebago in English, and it's based on that Winnebago oak, Dirty Water by Green Bay. So these people were part of it, and I forgot to put this slide up. There's too much to try and convey. But there's a book by, it's called The Stories of Ojibwe Narratives of Charlotte and Charles Cobbalgum, and it's put out by the Marquette Historical Association. And this Charles Cobbalgum, his father was Makade Gijgat, and then his brother was Wabmimi, and Wabmimi was a chief here on the Canadian side, he said. Anyway, what Charles Cobbalgum said is they had a wampum belt of alliance with the Ojibwe, the Odawa, Wodeotamik, Menominee, and Ho-Chunk. And it had, he didn't say five diamonds, but that's what I assume that it is. And that he said that Wabamimi is the keeper of it on the English side of our territory. So I meant to ask the late, my old buddy there, the late Blaine Bellow, if he ever heard his old people talk about a wampum belt that they kept by Wabmimi, and if there's anybody Gishpin Giabe Meojigadekwe knows if that name is still carried here. I don't know if that name is. I know in the States there's a people called White Pigeon, but I didn't know if here on Garden River or Batchewana, if people still carried that name, and then if they did, if they know what happened to that belt. Anyway, that's the thing, is we got to try and bring these belts out and keep them, reactivate them, and like what Angus was talking about, bringing this all together and strengthening it. Then these are the ones from the so-called Canadian side. The Chippewas visiting Drummond Island from Drummond Island, Sault Ste. Marie, La Cloche, and C. So 1824, 25, and 26, you see that there were 11 deserving chiefs. And these are chiefs that distinguished themselves during the War of 1812. But then there are 3, 1, and 2 that weren't distinguished chiefs that didn't go fight during the War of 1812. So this is what they actually broke this down then. They were trying to keep track of who was there. So we know some of the names of these chiefs, and they were in that boat that I showed you. So, and there are also others as well. And one of them was Migaze from Nipsing Dokis area. So here's these are different paintings of different chiefs, and these one of them is Makons, the other is Abon Weshkam, and Menedawabe, Talgewe Nene, Jean-Baptiste Siganak, John Sunday, Midway, and Shawan Oswe, Shawan Agijik, Bemasage, and Mitigwab. So here, this is a painting of Mokmanish, and he had 2 names, Mokmanish, and then they translated in English as little knife, but it's actually the damned knife. And his English name when he got baptized was Frederick, and his other second Anishinaabe name was Bebamadabi. He goes around dragging whatever he was dragging. Sometimes I think because he actually was a keeper of the belt, but I don't know if his name was that as he grew into that, or if he was given that name when he became a keeper of the belt. I actually don't think it was associated with that till it just happened to be a circumstance. So he was wounded on the Wabash River, which is very far south in Ohio, and later on he petitioned for his pension, but he was awarded a sword for his acts of bravery and compassion on the battlefield. So on his lap there you see that sword. And here he's got a gorget, and these are called epaulettes. They would give these to, like what a general wears, those lace. And he's got what they call a Lorraine cross here as well. So this is actually the sword, and I guess it was collected by a family that owned a store in Mantuaning called the Maston Reynolds collection. And I happened across it when I went to the Canadian War Museum one time. I went over there and I saw all these swords when I was in their storeroom, and I said, "Do you got any swords associated with Indians?" And the guy says, "There's one with about a little knife or something." And then I saw it and I was like, "Oh, geez, this is it." Because I just read of this. I had read this petition and I had seen this certificate where he says, I hereby certify that the bearer hereof, the Odawa chief, the Little Knife, is an Indian of a most respectable character, a brave warrior, and he has always been distinguished for his loyalty and attachment to the British government. In testimony of my approbation of his conduct upon this occasion, which will be so gratifying to the King, the Great Father, and to encourage similar acts of mercy to the future, to the anguished and unresisting, I in his name present him with the silver-mounted sword to him of his merit, given under my hand and sealed Michilimackinac, 8th day of June, 1815. A similar sword was given to the Odawa chief Okeda, and these Okedas are actually from, now they live principally in Jishiguaning on Manitoulin Island. And I was talking to Frank Lewis at Serpent River one time, but he actually came to the OCF, Ojibwe Culture Foundation, and he said when he was working as a child, they were plowing, and they dug up a sword by accident. So I often wondered if that was the sword that they dug up. Anyway, Wikwemkong has a replica of this made, and they actually they own it, but the original is still with the Canadian War Museum. And this is Jean-Baptiste Siganac. He distinguished himself during the War of 1812, and he fought at Beaver Dams, Fort Meigs, Frenchtown, at defense of Michilimackinac, and he was awarded a blue silk flag for services on the Niagara front, and his brothers are Makadebenese, Apakazagan, Ningwigan, and his nephew was Bemnakanang. The fella Ningwigan, his brother, actually fought for the Americans. So it also shows us that we weren't all for the British. This Ningwigan actually sided with the Chimokmanak. So this is the outfit he was given, an admiral's uniform with those boots and the cockneyed hat, and what Louis de Bosque Guy Windemak, Bapasan Dip. That's why they call that somebody who's a boss. They'll say Bapasan Dip, and it's because when they wear these hats, and it's like a woodpecker head. But when the war ended, he was actually commissioned to take this wampum belt and declare the peace all along the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. And then Nibalcom, the Ojibwe chief, was actually commissioned to take that same belt and declare the peace all along the western shore of Lake Huron. They tried to make, of course, this still happens today, where you see this, that the Jaganash wants to deal with just one, what they would say, one Indian. They don't want to deal with all you chiefs. They want to just deal with one chief. And so even back then, in 1821, they wanted to make Siganac the Grand Chief. So they gave him these gorgets, armbands, and they wanted to declare him the Grand Chief of all the Western Confederate tribes. He refused it. This is also another chief who was painted by Paul Kane. So the Manitowabi family in Wiki says that this is their ancestor. I'm kind of not too convinced of that yet, because there's two names, Nidowabe, and here when he painted him, Paul Kane translated his name as He Devil. Now I just say that because that's, if you're doing research, you have to know what the painting is called. A woman came up to me after I had done this presentation, and she was really upset that I said he devil, that the name was devil. Of course, it's not devil, it's nido, as a spirit. Anyway, but that's what they translated as. But you're not, if you actually trying to research this and you put he spirit, male spirit, you're not going to find anything. So we got to use what they labeled in a sense if you want to re-find it, if you want to find it for yourself. So that's why I use what they said. Anyway, that's Abe, like Anishinaabe, the male spirit, or Yabe, with people you hear Glenn Hare come around, he'll always talk to these guys and he'll say, Ani Yabe, buck, that the male of the spirit. But Nidowabe sees as a spirit. And you hear some of the elders in Wiki say Mendawabit, the one who sees as a spirit. So those are two different names. And then this guy fought during the War of 1812 at Detroit, and you see his clan at the side here. I'm not too sure what it is because it's poorly drawn, but this is from a petition at Sandy Island by Wasauksing. Of course, this is Jagua Kons. And then he had written a petition, and he said that he had fought with 700 men down at Niagara. And then on the third day, the first 2 days, he led the charge, and he was victorious. And on the third day, he said that they encountered a Nottowek. And that when he chased the Nottowek away, they went too far in. And then some of them at that point were killed. And he says only a number of them made it back alive from that encounter. But this is his pipe tomahawk and his war club, and those are at the Royal Ontario Museum. This is a special medal that was struck called a General Military Service Medal, and it was only given to people who were still alive in 1850, and if they were still alive, they got this medal, and that if they had fought at either Chateauguay, Chrysler's Farm, or Detroit. And so Jean-Baptiste Talgewenene, who ends up signing the 1850 treaty for Wanapate, but was living at Wequemcong. He actually fought during the War of 1812 and was at Detroit and was alive in 1849, so he got this medal. I don't know where the medal is now. I don't know if the family still has it. This fella's son was named Jaco. Now they say Jaco. But Jaco Talgewenene is the one, and they were Caribou clan. The other thing that I want to tell you is this guy at this point was actually not a chief. I'd like to do more research on him because he was part of the Potawganasing band. And Potawganasing is the Drummond Island. So he actually was under Niwakam and Debosque. Debosque was his chief. And then later on, when 1850 comes, then he claimed Wanapate. So it's just an interesting thing to look at. And then here we have Shawanagijik also fought, and he was from Whitefish Lake, a Tikmaikshing. So one of the things that I wanted to mention to you as well is when I was asked to go to Shawanaga in September, and then I prepared a PowerPoint, but it didn't actually. We were outside and we didn't have a projector and screen and all this. And I wanted to talk about these medals a bit. Anyway, these medals are symbols of alliance. And the medal that was given to each of these chiefs back then was actually meant to be passed down to the successive chief. But what ended up happening is some of the people ended up thinking that was my grandfather's and that's mine. And then so they ended up taking what we call cultural patrimony and making it individual property. And then when it became individual property, then you sell it off. And then it gets removed from the community. But the chiefs used to pass this on to the next chief. And then the next chief would wear this and use it as a reminder. And they would use it, the circle was the reminder of the never-ending relationship. So a chief named Gimini Jogan. Gimini Jogan means the bastard. And Ni Jogan is a child, but Gimi Gim is secretive. Gimode, you steal, and so Giminijogan, the bastard or the child made in stealth, would really be what the literal translation would be. So he says, you see these marks, and that's what they would call a medal, a mark. And they would go into these councils at Drummond Island or St. Joseph's Island. They said, I want a mark. I want you to mark me. And now when somebody goes and blazes a trail in the bush, they say, Anishinaabe gi ginwak chike. He blazed the trail. He either cut a mark in the tree. And so these medals, they actually would call a ginwach jagan or ginwach jawan, that it was a mutual mark with each other. You see these marks, the master of them is dead and they are left without an owner. We deliver them to you. Do as you think proper with them. These are the deceased sons, pointed to two young men. This is the ancient mode which we learned from our ancestors. Whoever you give them to must be the chief to replace the one we have lost. So this Giminijogan was returning from Detroit, and he drowned in the Detroit River. And but his sons, he had two sons. One that was Giminijogan, then the other was Ginuanagaze. Ginuanagaze, he looks like or has the appearance of Ginu, the golden eagle. Anyway, they gave medals to both of them, and then the flag went to Giminijogan. So, but this is one. This is why I bring this up. It's interesting is because here's where sometimes we got into difficulty when we started to accept or look to what they called back then our great father to actually recognize who our chiefs were. But that isn't really what they were doing. In a sense, they weren't asking him permission to say who the chief was. What they wanted to make sure is that when these two young men came to the fort with their young men or their band, they wanted to make sure that they were recognized as chiefs by that commanding officer. So that's what they're saying to him. We want you to know who we selected to replace this chief that died. They weren't really asking permission, but it was just a way of interacting how you get things done. That they were actually saying, here's these two young men, their father has died. We want both of these men to be recognized as chiefs. But if we recognize them as chiefs and they show up and you don't recognize them, then they're going to be embarrassed or get turned away from the fort. So this was a gorget that was made for Chief Okeda, and maybe you can't see it, but there's a bear in the background, and that's his totem. But this was given by Lewis Cass to him in 1820 at a treaty. So this became, when I testified in the court case and in my report for the Robinson Huron Treaty, I was asked by the legal team to actually write about the covenant chain and its relationship and understanding, the chief's understanding of treaty relationship. They said, bring it up from 1764 right up to September 6th, 1850. What did the chiefs understand the treaty relationship to be? So I talked about the treaty relationship as the covenant chain. One of the things that my report, they actually commented on is that there actually was no 24 Nations belt. And here in this particular slide here, so I took a picture of this council that was held in Drummond Island in 1818 on July 7th. And this is the beginning. It says, the Odawas, Chippewas, and Winnebago Indians assembled at Drummond Island, requested to hold a council. Accordingly, about 350 men were seated in front of Lieutenant Colonel McKay, the Superintendent Marquis. The chiefs aid the camp, laying down a broad wampum belt made in 1764, one made in 1786, and one marked Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDougall, commanding Michilimackinac, with the pipe of peace worked on it. So at this council, they actually didn't bring out that 24 Nations belt. So here's what I would have thought the belt, they would have brought that fort belt out. So that's the 24 Nations belt. And this belt is the one where they actually made the promises that this ship would always be full. They said, "Kai wika the naushkanestano kadoji manoa," that your ship will never be empty, that it'll always be full, and that meaning it'll have all kinds of cloth, blankets, net, fish line, cod line, ammunition, ball, and shot. Anyway, as part of my report, I had talked about these presents, and that these presents were delivered each year, and that this was part of the Treaty of Niagara, and that the Wampum Belt, 24 Nations Wampum Belt, was actually that particular engagement. So the Crown's expert witness said, in 1818, they actually don't bring this belt out, and it's not listed. And then in an earlier council, he says, in July of 1764, in the Sir William Johnson papers, he said he gave the great belt of the Great Covenant chain, but he actually never wrote in there, and 24 Nations belt. So what became a sticking point in the court case was that he says, the expert Alan Corbiere says that this belt actually, there's no actual documentation of when this belt was given to the Anishinaabeg, and that therefore this wasn't part of the treaty, was kind of what they were aiming at. Anyway, our chiefs always said that these belts were given by Sir William Johnson at Niagara, but it does look like, you look at the evidence, the written documentation, they actually don't have that belt there, and the belt actually makes its first appearance in 1849. The Indian agent Thomas Anderson actually writes that he's filling out a questionnaire, and they ask each Indian agent if they have any memorials about their land, and he says all they got are these wampum belts with the hieroglyphics on it, and one of them is with 24 men holding hands and the island of North America and a ship, and they say that this is the promise that presents would be given every year. Anyway, this is just to highlight to you that some of you didn't watch or hear about the arguments about the court case. This became a little bit, not a major thing, but if we ever end up going to court over these presents, that's what's probably going to be made an issue, is that this belt actually isn't in the record until 1849, 1850, and that the chiefs don't bring it out for whatever reason on different occasions. So again, he says, this is Okeda, who's the speaker. "My heart now fails me, I can hardly speak. Those bad spirits, the Americans, take possessions of our lands without consulting us. Father, our chiefs did not consent to have our lands given up to the Americans, but you did it, my father, without ever consulting us." So one of the things that I was asked to do as well at that court case was I wanted to talk about how our chiefs talked about treaty. And in this case, they actually use metaphoric language, whereas the English use what they call legalese. So when you hear legalese, you read, if any of you have made your will, you have a specific, like even when I read, I haven't made my will yet, but we're trying to look at how to do this, and I need a dictionary to actually go through what does this mean, how does that mean. So that's how these treaties were made in the English way, but with the Anishinaabe, they actually use metaphoric language. So here, this is what the Okeda had said. "Father, he the king, said he would again build a fire," and in brackets on this is an interesting document if you ever want to learn about the metaphors used. So he says, "He would again build a fire and plant a tree on our lands that would never die, though the bark would be taken off, and that round the tree you would raise a strong hill. All this, my father, has come to pass. Your words have been true. Your words were smooth and pleasant." But somebody wrote in there in brackets that after he said you would build a fire, and he put in brackets a fort. And he said, and you would plant a tree, and he put brackets a flagstaff. And he said, and you would raise a strong hill, and they put in brackets a fortification. So instead of just saying, you said you would come and build a fort and erect a flagstaff on this fort, they actually spoke in a higher, different language to do that. And in Ojibwe, that's what the chief said, Bem Ganeshkang wrote in 1862. He says, Ndoj ton Pakodana, I make a hill here. I make a high hill. Eshpak manda shpadnak. He says, I make it very high. And then he says, on top of that, in Badak Shama Mabam Tik, I stand up this tree here. And Jigaing Jishtege, I scrape away all around, I sweep it all around. So, Father, and he picked up the belt in his hands, and he says, Father, this my ancestors received from our father, Sir William Johnson. You sent word to all the red children to assemble at the crooked place. They all heard your voice, and next summer met you at that place. He then laid this belt on the mat and said, Children, you must all touch this belt of peace. I touch it myself, that we may be all brethren, united, and hope our friendship will never cease. I will call you my children, will send warmth, meaning presence, to your country, and your family shall never be in want. Look towards the rising sun. My nation is as brilliant as it is, and its word cannot be violated. So that's how we talked about our treaty relationship with them. So if we don't understand our own metaphors, we're not going to be further ahead. So we have to understand how our ancestors talked and framed our treaty relationship and how they talked about that. And that's why I'm using these speeches to talk to you today. Because if we had here a lawyer today, they would be talking to you about seed, relinquish, yield, and surrender. And of course, all those words are related in Ojibwe. From what I understand, we could just say begidnan. We don't make a distinguishment between seed, surrender, and yield. Whereas in legalese, those all actually mean three different things. So this was a petition written in 1823 by the Odawa of Larbercrosh, and they actually asked for education. They're starting to ask for education here. This again is Jean-Baptiste Signac, and he could write in Ojibwe. This letter is written in Ojibwe, and it goes with that canoe that I showed you earlier. But he actually talks about that he quit drinking, and he wants to actually introduce religion to the Anishinaabeg. So here, Chief Ashagashi, who fought during the War of 1812, the reason I wanted to start by naming individual chiefs is to show you again, or to emphasize that these chiefs actually were battle-hardened men. These men went on the battlefield and they killed other men. So if we don't lose sight of that, then we see these guys coming back 15 years later, 10 years later, and they still see that their reality has changed, that they're no longer going to be able to procure a living for their children and grandchildren in the same way that they did. So they're seeing that their reality is changing, and they're making choices based on that, on what they have. And so one of them is actually education. They see that education is one of the means to make a better life for their children. And back then, education was intimately tied to Christianity, be it a Protestant or Roman Catholic. So when we see these, where you're going to see them, and people, now I find people are kind of condemning, in a sense, whenever they see that a chief advocated for Christianity back then. And then they seem to forget that these same men fought during the War of 1812, and they killed Americans, or they killed Anishinaabeg or Nodawek, Haudenosaunee, that were siding on the American side. So these weren't pushovers, is basically what I'm saying, is that these men fought and killed people, and then they then turned around. They wanted to keep peace, and they wanted to have the best for their children and grandchildren. And one of the ways was through education, they thought. So they saw that the Americans actually had at Michilimackinac, they had a school, and they saw that the kids there at the Anishinaabe kids that were going to school at Michilimackinac were actually learning to read and write, and that they were actually learning the trades. And so Ashawganshi at Drummond Island says, we're jealous of those people. We want our kids to learn that, but we're not Americans, and we don't have two hearts, they said. So we want you to build us a schoolhouse here and have a minister come and teach. And we want people to come and teach us trades as well. So there is the Deboske's Dodem, and that's we now know that's the hoof print of a caribou. And then Ashawganshi, that's it doesn't look like it, but that's a pike. So here in 1829, so like I mentioned, that from 1815 to 1828, the presents were delivered. The British Council Fire was at Drummond Island. But in 1829, the Americans were able to get Drummond Island declared as their land. And so the British garrison had to move to St. Joseph's Island. But at that time, Chief John Asantz, who was then at Penetanguishene, sent 2 wampum belts to St. Joseph's Island, and one to the Odawa and one to the Ojibwe. And he says, my relations, the time is at hand when our country will not supply us with food, and our children must starve if we do not look about us and change our way of living. This is another reason for our loving the Redcoats. They alone can and will support the Indians yet to be born. So he sends this belt to the Ojibwe, and he says, come and live with me at Coldwater, and we'll make a big community. So the underlying message here is they want to actually build up their numbers and to make a bigger community. So then he addresses another wampum belt to the Odawak. Friends, my heart is glad to hear that you have looked up to the Great Spirit, the Great Master of Life, meaning having become Christians. This is the only true road to happiness. Let us be of one mind and seek mercy from the same Great Spirit, who alone can direct our steps. The Redcoats give us their assistance. These are the only great objects we should look to, the Master of Life as our Heavenly Father, and the Redcoats as our earthly Father. So here again, this is the part that really you guys should really think about, you chiefs and counselors should really think about a bit more as well. Because now we just label this as paternalistic, that we're the red children and there's the great father. But what this actually, if you look at it in a bigger way, what the Anishinaabeg are trying to do is to make kinship, to make them get the British to actually have more obligations to them. By calling him a father, he has to be more benevolent and supportive. But he's not the same kind of father that an English father had. The English father was the authoritative figure, but in Anishinaabe society, the father wasn't an authoritative figure the same way that a Jaganash father was. So here what they wanted to do, each time they wanted to make relationship. And when Angus started off with his opening remarks, and that's one of the things he said, Dinwen Magnaduk, my relatives. That's what he addressed you all as, and then that's what the Anishinaabeg used to always do, and they still do. Dinwen Magnaduk. Bojo and Dinwen Magnaduk. They want to make you a relation. Of course, now some people say cousin to each other. But, and then of course if you go to ceremonial lodges, then you'll hear people address the ceremony maker as an uncle or grandfather. And even when we talk about those pipes and drums, we're talking about them as grandfathers. So it's the same thing. We're actually making a relationship, a familial or a kin relationship with them. It isn't about authority and power per se. It's about responsibility and obligations. So that's why I want to show you these and to read them out to you, but to make sure that you have it straight in your mind, because later on you're going to get questioned about this as well. at some point. So here, this is, of course, Jigua. And the other thing, when I always talk about this, but the reason I bring it back up is to show how far we've come along in our historical consciousness as well. Back in 2002, I had my friend make these wampum belts, these replica wampum belts that I showed you earlier. And whenever I went around talking about them, people would say, "We didn't use wampum belts. We're not Mohawks. What are you doing? Who do you think you are? We're not Nautiwik." So they would always say that to me. I don't know how many times that was said to me, but now nobody says that to me. They all recognize now that we used wampum, and it was just through not just me but others continuing to go out there and show that we used wampum, and that wampum belts and wampum strings were used extensively throughout the Great Lakes. And of course, your own chief here, Jigua, was one of the ones that knew this and used it. So he would hold these strings up, and he says, "The great master of life gave us pipes and wampum for the purpose of conveying our ideas from man to man. I return thanks to the great spirit that made me, and to my great father, the king, who supports me. What he promised to our forefathers, he continues to perform. He is charitable to the redskins." So this particular meeting at St. Joseph's Island is really richly documented. And you got Menominee chiefs coming, and 3 of them come and they give belts, or they give strings, and they give pipes. And with each of those ones, they say, "I give this pipe to you," and because what the British came at St. Joseph's Island, they came to say is that we're moving the council fire to Penetanguishene, and we invite you all to come. And so each of them came and they brought a pipe, and they said, I present you this pipe, and when I go to see you tomorrow, I expect to smoke from it. And so when they would say, I'll see you tomorrow, they're meaning next year. So that's how they would talk as well. And then they said, I present you these strings, and with this string of wampum, I make a road from here to Penetanguishene. And I'll follow this road that I make with this string tomorrow. So again, they're talking about their relationship, and they use these wampum strings to affect that. Sure. We'll have a 15-minute break then.